In this video, we'll be looking at gaseous exchange, but before we get started with that, let's look at these concepts over here. So you need to understand the difference between breathing, gaseous exchange, and then cellular respiration. So breathing is the actual mechanical process whereby air moves in and out of our lungs. And then gaseous exchange is the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide across a gaseous exchange surface. And then we have cellular respiration, which you are familiar with because of the previous chapter. It is the gradual release of energy from organic compounds such as glucose in the presence of oxygen. Now, why do we need gaseous exchange to take place? So firstly, we need to be able to absorb oxygen from the atmosphere and make it available to our cells for cellular respiration. As you know, oxygen is needed for that process to actually get going. Now, the cells will then release carbon dioxide, which we then need to get rid of. If that is not achieved, it can actually become quite toxic to the body, and this is one of the reasons. So the carbon dioxide, if there are high levels of that, it can lower the pH of the body fluids, which is not great. Now, even though this has actually been removed from the 2020 workload, if you can put it like that, I do find this quite important to understand and just have a basic background knowledge of the requirements of gaseous exchange. So firstly, you need to have a large surface area to maximize the amount of gaseous exchange that can take place. And thinking of the human lungs, if you were to open up the human lungs and cover a surface area of that, it would actually cover a tennis court, which is mind-blowing that is inside your body. So we've got a very big surface area for efficient gaseous exchange. Then the surface has to be thin for quick diffusion, as these gases have to move very quickly in and out. And then the surface has to be moist in order for the gases to diffuse through a membrane. And then it also has to be well protected because the gaseous exchange surface is thin and fragile. And in humans, we have our ribs that protect us. Then it also has to have a transport system to be able to transport these gases. And in humans, it is blood, for example. A definition that you've had since grade 8 is diffusion, so it should not be strange. Diffusion is the movement of molecules from a high concentration and then to a low concentration until an equilibrium is reached. You need to understand this because this is how gaseous exchange takes place. Adaptations that different organisms have for gaseous exchange. So there's 3 examples here that I've given. It's earthworm, fish, and then plants. Now, earthworm if you've ever played with an earthworm, most of you have done that, you will find that earthworms are quite slimy and they're moist, so that is already one of the requirements for gaseous exchange. And the reason they're so slimy and moist is because gaseous exchange actually takes place throughout the whole body of the earthworm, because their skin acts as a gaseous exchange surface. They don't have lungs, so oxygen will move in and carbon dioxide will move out, and then they also have a transport system that will help transport these gases. That's just a quick breakdown. Fish use gills for gaseous exchange, and then it's also a very large surface area since it's coiled and bendy like this, and they're quite stacked. So fish have a large surface area and it's moist because they're in the water. And then they also have a transport system. That's why the gills are this pinkish reddish colors, because there's a high blood supply in that area. So what happens is water moves in through the mouth and it gets pushed out through the gills, and then that is where gaseous exchange will take place from the oxygen-rich water into the blood. Plants, this is also not a strange concept to you. So they perform gaseous exchange through the stomata, which is this opening here, and then the stomata is opened and closed with the guard cells depending on different conditions. So if, let's say, there's harsh environmental conditions, it's very hot and the plant doesn't want to lose a lot of water, those guard cells will close so there's no movement of those gases. So we are going to look at human gaseous exchange now and how our bodies are structurally adapted for gaseous exchange. So firstly, the structure of our respiratory system is as follows. So we have air passages, lungs, and then the respiratory muscles, which we'll look at all in detail now. So the air passages that we have are the nasal cavities, pharynx or throat, the trachea, and or rather the windpipe, and then the bronchi and the bronchioles, excuse me. Then the nasal cavity, so we've got two nostrils that lead into the nose, as you all know. You've got the two nostrils, and then you've got hairs inside the nostrils that will filter the inhaled air. And the nasal cavities also have a mucous membrane that have ciliated columnar epithelial cells. So I've given a diagram up here so you can see what they look like. So this is the columnar epithelial cells, and then on top you've got the cilia that will help with sweeping movements in getting the dust particles or whatever foreign thing you've inhaled out of the nose. There are also goblet cells that help to secrete mucus that will trap dust and germs, and this also has an antiseptic effect, and it will also moisten the gaseous exchange surface. And then the cilia of the columnar epithelial cells will then perform sweeping movements, as I've spoken about, taking the dust and other unwanted particles away from the lungs. Looking at the pharynx or the throat, so the nasal cavities open up into the pharynx. So this is the nasal cavity, and then it goes out into the pharynx, which is the throat area. And this will also then open up to the esophagus and then the trachea. So the esophagus is this tube that sits right behind the windpipe. And then this is also lined, the throat is also lined with a mucous membrane that will perform the same functions as the nasal cavity. And then the trachea or the windpipe, so this one that sits in the front, so it sits in front of the esophagus, and then the larynx, which is made up of cartilage, is located at the top of the trachea. So the larynx is what holds your, let's call it your voice box, that enables you to speak. And then the epiglottis, I think I've drawn over it. So the epiglottis is this portion over there. I'm going to encircle it quite largely. So the epiglottis is like a little flap. So as soon as you swallow, that flap closes the opening of the windpipe so that food doesn't go in there and that it goes straight down the esophagus. But sometimes you are breathing while you should be swallowing, and then you get some food that accidentally goes down before the epiglottis can close, then you'll immediately have, well, a coughing fit to get the food particles out. Then the walls of the trachea are kept open by C-shaped cartilage rings, so you can actually take your fingers and put them just over your throat, just rub them lightly. You'll feel that they're, well, riffles, and that is the C-shaped cartilage rings. And what this does is it allows the esophagus to expand behind it. So I'm going to try and draw this, but it might be horrific. So the C-shaped cartilage rings, so let's pretend this is now the windpipe. So it's got those C-shaped cartilage rings. Then behind it, you've got the esophagus. So let's say you've been overindulgent and you've had a big bite of food. If this were an O-shaped ring, which means it would be solid, food would struggle to get past that. So the C-shaped ring actually allows the esophagus to expand a bit into the windpipe so that the food can then pass behind it. And then the C-shaped rings are also covered with involuntary muscle tissue, and it is also lined with a mucous membrane of ciliated columnar epithelial cells that will also secrete that mucus. And then just as before, the cilia sweep dust and germs that are trapped in the mucus up to be coughed out or swallowed. Looking at the bronchi and the bronchioles, so the trachea divides into a right and a left bronchus that will then enter the right and the left lung. So you've got two lungs, if you didn't know. So the trachea goes down and still has the C-shaped cartilage rings. Then it branches into two bronchi. Plural is bronchi, singular is bronchus. So it branches into those two. So this will lead to the left and the right lung respectively. And then it is also lined with mucus, a mucous membrane, and they are then in this case held open by O-shaped cartilage rings. So the trachea, which is C-shaped, is now different here because there's no longer an esophagus that needs to pass behind the two bronchi, so they have O-shaped rings. And like it says here, held open. And the reason for that is, think of you drinking a very thick wimpy milkshake with a very thin straw. As soon as you're going to suck on that straw, it's going to close. Whereas if you've got a very thick, strong straw that's nice and big, you're going to be able to drink that milkshake to your stomach's content, if you would like to say it like that. So the O-shaped rings just help open up the bronchi. Then the bronchi divide into smaller branches, and they then lose their cartilage and they form the bronchioles. So let me just clear up the diagram there. So then the bronchi, you can see that they branch into smaller pieces, and those are then the bronchioles. And at the end of the bronchioles, you'll find the alveoli, but we'll get to that now. So each bronchiole ends in an infundibulum, which consists of a group of alveoli. So alveoli are the single, let's say grape-like structures, and then all of them together are known as the infundibulum. So there's a nice little diagram down here. So you've got the bronchus, then the bronchus divides into the bronchiole, and then at the end of this bronchiole, you'll have the infundibulum, also known as an alveolar sac, and then that infundibulum is made up of a little, or a lot actually, a lot of these little alveoli. Getting to the lungs, so the external structure, you've got two lungs, and then those lungs are protected by 12 pairs of ribs that have intercostal muscles, and then the right lung has 3 lobes, and the left lung has 2. And if I go up, you'll see why. So the right lung here has 3 lobes, and then the left lung will only have 2 lobes. And the reason for that is because the heart just sits slightly more to the left, so that allows for room for the heart to fit in. Then the lungs are spongy and elastic. Well, they have to be to hold that amount of air, and they are surrounded by a membrane called the pleura that is filled with fluid that prevents friction when the lungs expand or contract. So the pleura, you can see on this diagram, just sits in between the lungs and the ribs. So there's the ribs, you've got the lungs, and then the pleura will sit in the middle with that fluid that will prevent friction when the lungs expand and contract. And then you've got the diaphragm, which is a dome-shaped muscle plate below the lungs. There's a nice representation of that over here. So you've got the 2 lungs and then the diaphragm, which will help the lungs inhale and exhale. Then the internal structure of the lungs, we've done this before. So you've got the bronchi that divide into smaller branches. They lose their cartilage and they form bronchioles. And then each bronchiole ends in an infundibulum, which consists of a group of alveoli. These alveoli walls are thin and they have squamous epithelium. So this we have not done. So once again, remember, one of the requirements for gaseous exchange is that it has to have a thin well, not a thin, but a thin area over which gaseous exchange should take place. And this is with the squamous epithelium. And then they are surrounded by capillaries, so the blood that helps with the transport. And then the walls of the capillaries consists of also a single layer of squamous epithelium or endothelium. So if we go up, you'll see that you've got the infundibulum, and then the infundibulum is surrounded by the capillaries that will help with diffusion. Now we're going to look at the respiratory muscles. So you've got the diaphragm, which we looked at on the right hand side here, and when it is relaxed, it's this dome shape, and when it's contracted, it will be flat. And then it forms an airtight thoracic cavity separating the chest from the abdomen below. And then you've got the intercostal muscles, which are the muscles that sit in between the ribs, and you get external and internal intercostal muscles. And if you enjoy eating ribs, you're actually eating the intercostal muscles of the pig or the cow. Next, we'll look at the mechanism of breathing. So it is the movement of air between the atmosphere and the lungs, and this is caused by a difference in air pressure between the atmospheric air and the air inside the lungs. So it's because of the pressure on the outside versus on the inside that will cause the breathing to occur. Now, ventilation of the lungs takes place in two phases. So we've got inhalation and then exhalation. So inhalation is when air moves into the lungs, in, and exhalation, exit, air moves out of the lungs. Now, looking at the process of inhalation, this is known as an active process. Okay, and the reason for that is, so the diaphragm will contract and it becomes flatter. So you can see this arrow down here is moving downwards. That's just to indicate that the diaphragm will contract and it becomes flatter. This will cause the thoracic cavity to enlarge from top to bottom. And then the external intercostal muscles will contract. So these muscles in between will contract, causing the ribs to move upwards and outwards. And then the thoracic cavity will enlarge from side to side and front to back. So I know this might sound confusing, but all you really need to do is you need to know some of the key words in here. That was an ugly bracket. And then just sit when you have to answer this type of question in the exam. Just sit and inhale. And then you have a look at what your body is doing. So the thoracic cavity enlarges from side to side and front to back. The abdominal muscles relax so that the abdominal cavity can accommodate the viscera. So the viscera is all the internal organs, and this being pushed down by the diaphragm. So the diaphragm is actually going to press down on those internal organs. And then the total volume of the thoracic cavity will increase because everything has now expanded. And then the pressure in the thoracic cavity and the lungs decrease. And this causes the elastic lungs to expand. And since the atmospheric pressure is higher than the pressure in the thoracic cavity and the lungs, oxygen-rich air flows into the lungs. So it means that, I'm just going to repeat, so the air pressure on the outside, the atmospheric pressure, is much higher than on the inside. And because that is, air will want a way to escape into so that the pressure becomes less, and that is through your mouth and into your lungs. So exhalation is a passive process, meaning that it requires a little less energy. So in this case, the diaphragm will relax and it moves back to that dome shape. And the thoracic cavity will become smaller from top to bottom. So there's what it looked like with inhalation, and now it is much smaller with exhalation because you're going to lose a little bit of the air inside your lungs. Now the external intercostal muscles will relax. This will cause the ribs to move downwards and inwards, so your chest goes down, and this will cause the total volume of the thoracic cavity to be reduced, and it will also reduce from side to side and front to back. I skipped that one. And then the pressure in the thoracic cavity and in the lungs increases. So this means that in your lungs at the moment, the air pressure is much higher than on the outside with the atmospheric pressure, and that will cause air to leave your lungs. And carbon dioxide rich, I missed the oxygen here at the top, so just know it is a lowercase 2, CO2. Rich air flows out of the lungs. So in this case, carbon dioxide will exit. And I've given this because they have asked this previously, the composition of inhaled air versus exhaled air. So as you know, air is made up of nitrogen, oxygen, carbon dioxide, and then a little water vapor. But if you look at the numbers of inhaled versus exhaled air, you'll see that nitrogen stays the same. With inhaled air, oxygen concentration is around 21%, and when you exhale, it's around 15%, because remember, your body has used some of that oxygen. Then look at the difference between carbon dioxide. So with inhaled air, carbon dioxide is 0.04%, and when it is exhaled, it is 4%. And just a little interesting fact, when somebody is hyperventilating or they're struggling to breathe, they'll give them a brown paper bag to breathe into. And a lot of people will ask, but why? Because there's carbon dioxide going out. Yes, there is more carbon dioxide in exhaled air than inhaled air, but look at the oxygen percentage. There's still oxygen, and that oxygen will be sufficient enough for the person to receive oxygen to breathe and perform bodily functions with. Now we're going to look at gaseous exchange itself. So we've looked at how air moves in and out of the lungs. Now we're going to look at gaseous exchange. So this takes place in the alveoli and tissues. There's two areas specifically that we are going to look at. So gaseous exchange in the alveoli, so in the lungs. The inhaled air in the alveoli have a higher oxygen concentration than the blood in the surrounding blood capillaries. Now, a diffusion gradient is therefore created between the air in the alveoli and the oxygen, basically, and the blood in the capillaries. So the oxygen dissolves in a thin layer of moisture that lines the alveoli and diffuses through the thin walls of the squamous epithelium of the alveoli and the endothelial walls of the capillaries into the blood. Now, looking at the squamous epithelium, so let's look at this one. You can see it's very thin. As we noted before, we need it to be thin so that diffusion can take place much easier. I just wanted to quickly show you that. Then the blood that reaches the alveoli from the tissues have a higher concentration of carbon dioxide than the air in the alveoli, so a diffusion gradient is therefore created between the blood in the capillaries and the air in the alveoli, meaning that carbon dioxide diffuses from the blood in the capillaries through the endothelial walls of the capillaries and thin squamous epithelial walls of the alveoli into the air in the alveoli. So if what I just read did not make any sense, let's look at this. So the air coming into the alveoli is rich in oxygen, and the blood is rich. The blood is rich in carbon dioxide. Now we need to get rid of the carbon dioxide and we need to get oxygen back into the blood. So what will happen is that because there's a high concentration of oxygen in the alveoli, so in the lungs, and a low concentration of oxygen in the lungs, there will be a diffusion gradient that forms. So oxygen will move from a high concentration in the lungs to a low concentration in the blood capillaries, and then it will be transported to the rest of the body. Whereas carbon dioxide is in a high concentration in the blood and in a low concentration in the alveoli, so it will move from a high concentration in the blood to a low concentration in the alveoli, and then it will be exhaled. And this is just another representation of the infundibulum with the capillary surrounding it. Looking at gaseous exchange in tissues, so oxygenated blood reaches the tissues, so this is now coming from the lungs, and the blood in the capillaries has a higher oxygen concentration than the cells in the tissues, so this represents the cells of the tissue. So this could be your muscle tissue, for example, and now a diffusion gradient is created between the blood and the tissue of the cells. The cells of the tissue. And then the oxygen diffuses through the endothelial walls of the capillaries into the tissue fluid that surrounds the cells and into the cells. Now the cells will have a higher amount of carbon dioxide than in the blood capillaries, so once again a diffusion gradient is created between the cells and the blood capillaries, and then the carbon dioxide will move from the cells into the tissue fluid and then diffuses into the blood in the capillaries. So let's look at this. there's a high concentration of carbon dioxide in the muscles or the tissue, and this is because of cellular respiration that has just happened. So there's a high concentration of carbon dioxide in the tissue, but a low concentration of carbon dioxide in the blood. So carbon dioxide will move from a high concentration to a low concentration. And now the blood is once again rich in oxygen because it's just come from the lungs. So there's a high concentration of oxygen in the blood and a low concentration in the tissue. So oxygen will move from a high concentration to a low concentration, and thus diffusion has just occurred. Now the transport of gases in the blood. So oxygen is transported with hemoglobin. So oxygen and hemoglobin combine and it forms oxyhemoglobin, and then a small amount of the oxygen will diffuse into the blood plasma. Then with carbon dioxide, so most of the carbon dioxide that diffuses from the cells into the blood capillaries combines with water to form carbonic acid, which after which it dissociates and it is transported as bicarbonate ions. Now a portion of that combines with hemoglobin as well, and it forms carboaminohemoglobin, and a small amount of carbon dioxide dissolves into the blood plasma as well. So we've got two similar things here happening with hemoglobin. Oxygen and hemoglobin will form oxyhemoglobin, and carbon dioxide and hemoglobin will form carboaminohemoglobin, and then both can also dissolve in the blood plasma, which is what we have seen here. So this is carboaminohemoglobin because it is combined with the red blood cell, which contains hemoglobin, and then we've got that carbonic acid that combines with water, which then will form bicarbonate ions, and then lastly you've got the carbon dioxide that dissolves in the plasma. Looking at the effects of exercise on the lungs. So during exercise, the body needs more oxygen so that respiration can occur faster and more energy can be released, because we need oxygen for cellular respiration. And as a result, more carbon dioxide is released and the body has to get rid of that excess carbon dioxide. And this happens when we breathe in more oxygen-rich air and breathe out more carbon dioxide-rich air during exercise. And this will also then increase the rate of and depth of breathing, as well as the heart rate that will accelerate in order to increase the oxygen coming in to the muscle tissue and the carbon dioxide removal from the muscle tissues, as you know that blood is the main transport there. Then the heart rate and the breathing rate are controlled by the medulla oblongata. So the medulla oblongata of the human brain controls the breathing rate. So that is the cerebellum, you've got the cerebrum, you've got the corpus callosum, and then pay special attention. The first hump is the pons, and the second hump is the medulla oblongata, which is the portion that you should know about. Then the respiratory center sends nerve impulses to the respiratory muscles, so the diaphragm and the intercostal muscles, and this will tell them to accelerate or decelerate the contraction or relaxation process. Now the cardiovascular center is also located in the medulla oblongata, and this will control the heart rate. So both of these, the heart rate and the breathing rate, are found in the medulla oblongata. And the cardiovascular center, in this case, will send nerve impulses to the heart muscles to accelerate or decelerate the contraction or relaxation of those muscles. Next, we'll look at lung capacity, and this can look quite intimidating, but it's not that bad as long as you keep track of all the different names. So lung capacity refers to the total volume of air that the lungs can accommodate. Let me just get a different color here. Now the human lung capacity is around 5 liters, and the amount of air that is breathed in and out during normal breathing is called tidal volume. So that's a definition. And then after normal inhalation, it is possible to breathe in additional air, and this is known as the inspiratory reserve volume. Now, in the other case, it is possible to breathe out additional air after normal exhalation once again, and this is known as the expiratory reserve volume. So don't get confused between those two. Now, these two reserve volumes, as well as the tidal volume, are collectively known as the vital capacity of the lungs. And then even after the full expiratory reserve volume has been exhaled, there is still air left in your lungs, and this is known as the residual volume. And this never leaves your lungs. There's always a residual volume, although the air is mixed, so you don't get bad air in the lungs. So with each inhalation, fresh air mixes with the residual volume. Now the graph below shows the different volumes of air in the lungs, and we'll look at that now. So during times of increased demand for oxygen, so for example during exercise, the tidal volume will increase by using the reserve air volume to get more fresh air into the lungs. Now the result that the depth and rate of breathing is that it will increase, and then the depth of breathing can be determined before and after each exercise by measuring the tidal volume before and after exercise. So you've got the total lung capacity that sits here, you've got the residual volume here that never leaves, then you've got the tidal volume, which is this small section here, you've got the inhalation reserve volume, which is the ones that you can breathe in extra, you've got the exhalation reserve volume, you've got the vital capacity, then you've got the exhalation capacity and the inhalation capacity. So you can just go have a look at that. Homeostatic control of breathing, how is that done? So in your body, you've got chemoreceptors in the walls of the aorta and at the base of the jugular arteries that are very sensitive to changes in the carbon dioxide concentration in the blood. So there on the right hand side are those chemoreceptors I just mentioned. Now, as soon as the carbon dioxide concentration in the blood increases, so this can be after or during exercise, these chemoreceptors will send a nerve impulse to your respiratory or your cardiovascular centers in the medulla oblongata, and the respiratory center will in turn send a nerve impulse to the diaphragm and the intercostal muscles to accelerate the contraction or relaxation process in the muscles, and then the rate and depth of breathing will thus increase and more carbon dioxide laden air is exhaled. Now with the cardiovascular center, it will also send a nerve impulse to the heart muscles and the arterioles, and the heart rate increases, the arterioles will constrict and blood will flow faster. Now carbon dioxide is transported to the lungs faster, where it can be exhaled, and then the carbon dioxide concentration in the blood will return to normal.